There is a city the Bible calls the home of Satan's throne, not a metaphor, not a symbol, a real city on a real hill with a real altar that burned day and night for centuries, and a real man who stood in front of its fire and refused to bow. His name was Antipas, and the empire that killed him is dust. His name is still being spoken. Pergamum was the most powerful city in the ancient world that most people have never heard of. It had the second largest library on earth, the world's first psychiatric hospital, a legal system that could end your life before noon without a single trial, and a machine so sophisticated it could destroy a man completely without ever touching him. It controlled your job, your food, your neighbors, your children's future. All it asked in return was one small thing. Just bow your head. Just once. Some people did, some people didn't. And what happened to the ones who didn't will change the way you see your own world, your office, your screen, your daily life, forever. This is the story of the city where everything was for sale. And the one man who had nothing the machine could buy. Stay with us. This one goes deep. There is a city that sits on a hill, like a fist raised against the sky. Not the gentle rise of a countryside village, not the modest elevation of a market town, but a sheer, defiant ascent of stone and ambition that forces every visitor, every merchant, every pilgrim to look upward before they can look ahead. This is Pergamum, and in the 1st century of the Common Era, to arrive at its base and begin the climb toward its summit was to feel something ancient and uncomfortable stir in the chest. The specific primal recognition that you are small and that something above you is very, very large. The city rises in terraces, each one carved into the mountainside with the precision of a civilization that believed architecture was theology. At the top, at the absolute crown of this geological throne, stood the great altar of Zeus. It was not merely a place of worship, it was a statement, a declaration cut in marble and blood, visible for miles in every direction, burning day and night with fires that never went cold. Archaeologists who have studied its foundations describe it as one of the most sophisticated pieces of political architecture the ancient world ever produced. It was designed not just to honor a god, but to make you feel the weight of divine judgment pressing down on your shoulders from the moment you set foot in the valley below. The altar burned continuously. That is not a metaphor. The priests maintained fires on its elevated platform 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every single day of the year. And with those fires came a smell that the citizens of Pergamum could never escape. The thick, sweet, nauseating perfume of charred animal fat. It clung to the walls of homes. It settled into clothing. It woke you before dawn and followed you into your dreams. For those who called Pergamum home, that smell was the air itself. It was the scent of order, the scent of submission, the permanent, invisible reminder that the gods were watching and that the gods expected payment. But as you stand in that valley and breathe in the smoke curling down from the heights, a question forms slowly in the mind. A dangerous question. One that certain people in this city had begun to ask in whispers so quiet they barely disturbed the air. What happens when the smoke stops being ritual and starts being a record? What happens when the watchers on the hill are not looking at the altar but at you? That question would cost one man everything, and it would cost an empire its soul. To understand what Pergamum meant in the year 90 of the Common Era, you must first understand what it meant to be designated the capital of a Roman province. The emperor had elevated Pergamum above its rivals, above Ephesus, above Smyrna, and made it the administrative heart of the entire province of Asia. This was not merely an honor. It was a transfer of power so absolute, so total, that it altered the moral atmosphere of the city at the cellular level. The governor of a Roman province held what the law called the jus gladi, the right of the sword. It was not a metaphor. not a title, not an honorific. It was the literal, legal authority to end a human life on the spot, without trial, without jury, without appeal. The proconsul of Pergamum could look at a man in the morning market, decide that man was inconvenient, and have him dead before noon. The law permitted it. The law enshrined it. And the city knew it with the bone-deep certainty of people who had watched it happen. The Roman legal system made a ruthless distinction between a civis, a citizen, and a peregrinus, a subject. Citizens had rights, protections, the theoretical possibility of appeal to Rome itself. Subjects had the proconsul's mood. In Pergamum, the vast majority of the population fell into that second category. They were not Romans. They were conquered people living in a conquered city, governed by a man whose whim was the only law that mattered within the city walls. Historians who have studied the administrative records of this period describe the proconsul's authority as functionally unlimited within his jurisdiction, which is another way of saying the sword was always out of its sheath. It was simply a question of who it was looking for. And in a city of informants, a city where your neighbor's denunciation could earn them a favor from the magistrate, that sword was never truly at rest. It hovered, it waited, it had learned patience. The question that rose from the valley below the altar rose here too, sharpened to a different edge. The sword is loose. Who is it hunting? If the altar was the heartbeat of Pergamum's religious life, then the great frieze encircling its base was its theological manifesto, written in stone for anyone brave enough to read it. The gigantomachy, the battle of the gods against the giants, stretched nearly 400 feet around the altar's platform in a continuous, breathtaking narrative of violence and divine triumph. Zeus at the center, the Olympians arrayed in all their terrible beauty, and beneath them, writhing, broken, half-consumed by the earth itself, the giants screaming, grasping, defeated. It was not random mythology, it was political theology encoded in marble. The giants represented chaos, the barbarians, the non-Greeks, the non-Romans, the outsiders who did not understand the proper order of civilization. And the gods represented Rome, the empire, the machine, the system that had swallowed the world and called its appetite peace. Every citizen who walked past that frieze every single day received the same silent sermon. Chaos loses, order wins, and those who stand with the giants are crushed. The altar was elevated so dramatically that it could be seen from the distant valley floor on a clear day, from the harbor, from the roads leading into the city. You could not approach Pergamum without seeing, first and always, that altar, that fire, that smoke. It was the first thing and the last thing, the alpha and omega of the city's visual grammar. And the theology it preached was simple, ancient, and merciless. Look up. Know your place. The sky belongs to us. To look away was not an accident. To avert your eyes from the altar as you passed, even for a moment, was readable as a statement, a small, quiet act of refusal that a practiced informant could note and report. To look was to witness something the citizens of Pergamum had come to call simply the heartbeat of their world, pagan, burning, eternal. A heartbeat that certain people in the city had decided, at great personal cost, they would no longer follow. In the Roman world, justice was tactile. It had weight. You could hold it in your hand. The calculus, I'm the small stone used in judicial voting, was a tool as common in Roman courts as a gavel is in a modern one. White stones meant acquittal. Black stones meant condemnation. And in theory, this system represented the rational fairness of Roman law. The idea that a man's fate was decided not by the passion of a single judge, but by the collective reason of a deliberating body. In theory, In Pergamum, theory was a luxury for people who did not live under the shadow of the proconsul's jus gladi. The reality of the calculus system in a city this politically charged was something far darker than rational deliberation. The stones were white and black, yes, but the hands that held them trembled. The men casting their votes knew who was watching. They knew which magistrates were friends of the proconsul. They knew which neighbors had recently prospered after doing their civic duty. The secret ballot was only as secret as the room was safe, and no room in Pergamum was entirely safe. The psychological architecture of this system was a masterpiece of controlled terror. You were never directly threatened. The proconsul never stood over your shoulder as you voted. The pressure was invisible, ambient, total, the same way the smell of the altar smoke was invisible and total. You simply understood, without being told, that certain outcomes were expected, that the wrong vote for the wrong person at the wrong moment could make your name memorable in ways you did not want it to be memorable. And yet, and this is the detail that begins to crack the story open, in the letter that would eventually arrive from a prisoner on a distant island, the symbol of the white stone was reclaimed, repurposed, given a new weight that no Roman court could measure. A white stone with a new name written on it, known only to the one who receives it. Not a verdict. Not a verdict from any court this city could convene, but something else entirely, the promise that there existed a judgment no corrupted calculus could overturn. What kind of stone was this? What court issued it? That answer was still weeks away. For now, the stones in Pergamum were heavy, and men's hands were afraid. Pergamum possessed the second largest library in the ancient world. 200,000 scrolls, 200,000 individual volumes of mathematics, philosophy, medicine, history, rhetoric, astronomy, and literature, collected over generations by kings who understood that knowledge was the most efficient weapon ever devised. When the great library of Alexandria famously refused to lend its scrolls to Pergamum, the kings of this city responded by inventing an alternative writing medium. Thin sheets of treated animal skin that could be produced locally and in quantity. Parchment. Pergamena. The material that would ultimately carry the words of the Bible across the centuries was born here, in this city, as an act of imperial intellectual competition. But the library was not a free institution. No institution in Pergamum was free. Every scroll in its collection had been vetted by the standards of the regime that housed it. Knowledge that served the machine was preserved, copied, celebrated. Knowledge that challenged the theological or political foundations of Roman order was quietly removed, corrected, or never acquired in the first place. The library's curators were not censors in any obvious sense. They did not burn books dramatically in the street. They simply shaped the collection with the invisible pressure of institutional loyalty. What you could read, you could think. And what you could think, you could become. In a city of 200,000 scrolls, a city that prided itself on possessing the total accumulated knowledge of the civilized world, one document was about to arrive that had not been vetted by anyone. It had not been acquired through diplomatic exchange or purchased from a traveling merchant. It was smuggled, copied by hand in the darkness, passed from person to person through a network of people who had learned out of necessity to trust no one they hadn't personally vouched for. A letter from a prisoner, a letter from an old man on a barren island in the Aegean Sea, writing to a city he loved and feared for in equal measure. That letter, in a library of 200,000 scrolls, was about to burn brighter than all of them combined. They called themselves by no grand name. There was no banner, no official address, no roster that any Roman official could demand. They were a cell, a small underground community of believers who had learned to make themselves invisible in a city built on surveillance. They met in shifts because a large gathering attracted attention that a small one did not. They rotated locations, a cellar 1 week, a different home the next. the narrow space beneath a workshop the week after that. They timed their meetings to the rhythms of the city's noise, gathering when the sounds of the market covered the sound of their voices. The architecture of their hiding places was, in some cases, literally beneath the architecture of the temples above. Pergamum was a layered city, built on itself over centuries, with earlier structures buried beneath later ones. The believers had discovered that the foundations of the temples created natural voids, spaces that were dark and low and entirely outside the mental map of any Roman soldier doing his rounds. They met in the shadows of the shadows. They prayed in the spaces that the empire had, in building its monuments to false gods, inadvertently left empty. They had developed what we might today call security protocols. Specific knock sequences, trusted intermediaries, cover stories for the unlikely event that someone was stopped on the way to a meeting. One researcher who has studied the sociology of early Christian communities in Roman Asia Minor describes their operational security as remarkably sophisticated for a group operating without any professional intelligence training. They had learned from necessity. Necessity had made them careful, and careful had so far kept them alive. But the Roman night watch was thorough, and in a city of informants, even the most careful people left traces. The guards had been hearing a name, passed quietly in alleys, mentioned in hushed conversations that stopped the moment a uniform appeared nearby. A name attached to a face attached to a man who refused quietly and absolutely to disappear. His name was Antipas, and the soldiers of Pergamum had begun, with the slow deliberateness of a machine that is never in a hurry, to take note. The city did not need soldiers to control its population. Not primarily. Not for the daily grinding work of keeping 200,000 people obedient and productive and silent about the things that mattered. For that work, the real work of empire, Rome had something far more elegant, far more durable, and far more difficult to resist than a sword. It had the economy. Consider the baker. He wakes before dawn in a city that smells permanently of altar smoke, and he begins the work that his father did before him and his grandfather before that. He has a furnace, a family, a modest clientele who depend on him for their daily bread. He is not a philosopher. He is not a rebel. He is simply a man who has learned a trade and wants to practice it in peace. But to practice that trade in Pergamum, he must belong to a guild. This was not optional. This was not a matter of professional preference or voluntary association. Every craft, every trade, every commercial activity in the city was organized into a collegium, a guild, and membership was the price of doing business. Without it, you had no license. Without a license, you had no shop. Without a shop, you had nothing. The guilds were not sinister on their surface. They offered genuine benefits, collective bargaining with suppliers, legal protection against disputes, a social network that could help a craftsman survive a bad season. They were, in many ways, the small business associations of the ancient world, and they served real economic functions. But every guild meeting, every gathering of bakers or tanners or stonemasons or dyers began with the same ritual. A libation was poured, incense was burned, a prayer was offered to the patron deity of the trade, and alongside that deity, without exception, the name of the emperor was invoked, the divine Augustus, the Lord of all, the source of all grain, all water, all prosperity. This was the trap. Not a sudden dramatic confrontation, not a soldier at your door demanding you denounce your faith at sword point. Just a cup of wine, poured slowly, in a warm room full of colleagues, to a god you did not believe in. Just a pinch of incense held over a small flame as a courtesy, as a formality, as the price of bread. And the question that Antipas and the believers beneath the temple foundations had been wrestling with in their shifts in their dark and careful meetings was not abstract theology. It was the most practical question in the world. How do you feed your children when the price of bread is a pinch of incense to a false god? How do you maintain a conscience when your conscience is slowly bankrupting your family? There was no easy answer in the first century. There is no easy answer now. But the question itself, the sheer, exhausting weight of it, is where the real story of Pergamum begins. On the lower slopes of the Pergamum Acropolis, roughly a kilometer from the city center, there existed a complex that drew visitors from across the Roman world. Emperors had funded it, physicians had praised it, the sick and the desperate had traveled weeks on foot and by sea to reach its gates. The Asclepion of Pergamum was the most celebrated healing sanctuary in the ancient world, a sprawling campus of temples, pools, libraries, theaters, and sleeping halls dedicated to Asclepios, the god of medicine, whose sacred symbol was a serpent coiled around a staff. Modern medicine still uses that symbol today. But healing in the Asclepion was not a medical procedure in any sense that the modern mind would recognize. It was a total psychological and sensory experience, carefully engineered to dissolve the patient's individual will and replace it with something more compliant. Patients were first purified through fasting and ritual bathing. Then they were led through a long underground tunnel, a dark, low passage that archaeologists have excavated and walked through in the centuries since, where they could neither stand fully upright nor see more than a few feet ahead. The journey through the tunnel was disorienting by design. When you emerged into the central sanctuary, blinking and unsteady, the light and the space and the sound of fountains felt like grace. During the night, the critical period of what the priests called incubation, patients slept on the sanctuary floor. And as they slept, priests moved through the darkened hall, speaking through specially constructed acoustic channels in the walls and ceiling, small holes carefully positioned that directed sound with unsettling precision. The patient, half asleep, would hear a voice emerging from no specific location, seeming to come from the air itself, from the god himself, offering counsel, diagnosis, the prescription of specific rituals or treatments. And then there were the snakes. Sacred serpents kept in the sanctuary were allowed to move freely among the sleeping patients. The touch of a snake in the darkness, the cool muscular weight of it crossing your legs or your arm, was understood as a direct blessing from Asclepios, a laying on of hands from the divine. The early church in Pergamum had a name for this place. They called it, without ambiguity, a workshop of the enemy, a place where the architecture of healing was being used to perform something closer to the architecture of control. A place that took broken people and, in the act of appearing to restore them, reshaped them into something more useful to the system that had broken them. The city called it peace of mind. The believers called it something else. And the tension between those two descriptions, between the city's understanding of wellness and the church's understanding of truth, was one of the deepest fault lines running through Pergamum's daily life. It was not enough to control a man's labor. It was not enough to manage his access to medicine. The Roman system of social stratification in a city like Pergamum reached into every space where human beings gathered for any reason, for commerce, for entertainment, for civic ritual, for the simple pleasure of being among other people. The theater of Pergamum seated 10,000 citizens. Its seats were assigned not alphabetically, not by arrival time, but by social rank. And social rank was inseparable from demonstrated loyalty to Rome and to the official religious calendar. Your seat in the theater told everyone who saw you exactly where you stood in the city's hierarchy. And your position in that hierarchy was directly correlated with your visible participation in civic religious life. Did you attend the festivals? Did you make the required sacrifices at the required intervals? Did your name appear on the lists of those who had fulfilled their obligations to the imperial cult? If yes, good seat, good position in the market. favorable treatment when you needed a permit, a license, a ruling from the magistrate's office. If no, something else, something quieter and more comprehensive than punishment: erasure. The believers of Pergamum, those who refused the libations, who stayed home during the imperial festivals, who did not add their names to the lists, experienced this erasure in real time. It was not violent, it left no visible marks, but it was total. One researcher studying the social dynamics of early Christian communities in Asia Minor describes it as a comprehensive economic and social excommunication. You were not arrested. You were simply made invisible to the mechanisms that distributed resources and opportunities. Your application was perpetually lost. Your contracts were perpetually slow to be honored. Your children found doors perpetually, inexplicably closed to them. And watching all of this with the patient attention of people who had decided that social approval was worth any price, the informants took notes. They did not think of themselves as informants. They thought of themselves as good citizens, patriotic, practical, neighbors who understood how the world worked and who helped it work smoothly by keeping the magistrates informed of anything unusual. In a city this thoroughly organized around surveillance, isolation was not the first step toward punishment. It was the first step toward the furnace, and the furnace was patient. In every crisis, in every community under pressure, the fractures appear not at the boundary between the faithful and the faithless, but inside the faithful themselves. This is the uncomfortable truth that the history of Pergamum confronts us with. The greatest threat to the underground church was not the proconsul. It was not the night watch. It was not even the informants in the marketplace. It was the Nicolaitans. The name survives in the letter from Patmos as a mark of deep concern, a faction within the church itself that had developed a theological framework for what they called survival. Their argument was not cowardly exactly, it was sophisticated. It acknowledged the reality of the pressure, the genuine suffering of believers who had lost their livelihoods and their social standing. It asked the hard question that any honest person in their situation would have asked. If God sees the heart, and my heart is faithful, what does it matter if my body performs an empty formality to keep my family safe? The incense means nothing to me. The libation is just wine. The God I'm bowing to doesn't exist, so who is harmed? This is the philosophy that historians sometimes call rationalized betrayal, the incremental, logical, well-argued series of concessions through which a person convinces themselves that the thing they are compromising is not the thing they actually believe in. The Nicolaitans were not hypocrites in the simple sense. They were people who had looked at the cost of absolute integrity and decided that cost was too high, and then built a theology to justify that decision. God knows your heart. Just bow your head, keep the inner citadel sacred, and let the outer fortress fall. Antipas had heard this argument. He had sat in those dark, careful meetings and listened to men he respected make this case with genuine pain in their voices. And he had remained unmoved, not with the cold rigidity of someone who has never felt the pull of compromise, but with the specific, exhausted, costly firmness of someone who understands the argument perfectly and has simply decided that the slow rot of the inner citadel is a worse fate than the sword. He stood alone in that position, or nearly alone, and his solitude was beginning to make him visible in ways that the Night Watch had noticed. The Sebastean, the temple complex dedicated to the divine emperors, was the city's most modern achievement. Unlike the ancient altar of Zeus, which belonged to the Greek world that had preceded Roman conquest, the Sebastean was purely Roman in conception and function. It was designed for one purpose: to make the emperor real, tangible, present in the daily life of the city in a way that transcended political authority and entered something closer to the spiritual. The complex featured colossal statues of the deified emperors, Augustus, Claudius, Nero, rendered in a scale that made the human body feel provisional and small. These were not simply large images. They were engineered to create a specific psychological state in the viewer. The proportions, the placement, the lighting of the space around them were calculated to produce the sensation of being in the presence of something that exceeded the human. The statues were accompanied by friezes depicting the emperors subduing the barbarian world, feeding the hungry provinces, bringing order to the chaos of ungoverned nature. The message was identical to the gigantomachy on the altar of Zeus, translated into a new idiom. This man is divine. This man is the source of all good things, the water in your cup, the grain in your bread, the peace in your streets. These flow from him. This was the confrontation that the believers of Pergamum lived inside every waking hour. Not an abstract theological debate about the nature of divinity, but a sensory, social, economic, architectural confrontation between two irreconcilable claims. On one side, the seen God, rendered in marble 20 feet high, whose provision was measurable in grain and water and legal protection. On the other, the unseen king, known only through a letter from a prisoner, present only in the dark meetings beneath the temple foundations, whose provision was invisible, whose protection offered no exemption from the bronze bull. The friction between these two claims had been building for years. It was approaching something that could not be managed, something that would force a resolution. They came in the night, with torches and wax tablets, not soldiers, not yet, but the men of the census office, moving through the residential districts with the systematic thoroughness of an administration that had long ago learned to count people the way farmers count grain. The midnight census was not unusual in the Roman world. Periodic registration of population was standard administrative practice. But this census had a specific additional requirement, one that turned a bureaucratic exercise into a theological ultimatum. Every head of household was required to produce a libellus, a certificate of sacrifice, a physical document issued by the local temple authorities, confirming that the named individual had fulfilled their obligations to the imperial cult within the previous cycle. It was, in the most literal sense, a paper trail of compliance. No libellus meant you had not sacrificed. If you had not sacrificed, you were either negligent or foreign, or the possibility that made the census officials lower their voices, something else entirely. The demand for the libellus created its own specific horror, because the document itself was not easily replicated. Forgery was possible, but the penalties for a forged libellus, if discovered, were precisely the same as the penalties for simply not having one, and in some documented cases worse, because forgery implied premeditation. Refusing was a slow suicide. Forging was a fast one. The only clean option was compliance. And compliance meant exactly what it had always meant in Pergamum. A pinch of incense, a cup of wine, a signature on a document confirming that you had acknowledged formally and publicly that Caesar was Lord. The census officials moved through the city with their torches and their tablets. They checked names against their lists. They collected certificates. And when they reached a particular address, a modest home, unremarkable in every external detail, they found the household, they recorded the names, and then they moved to the next column. The name Antipas was present in the household registry, but where the column for the libellus should have contained an official temple seal, there was nothing. A blank, an absence as loud as a confession. The officials noted it. They moved on, but they noted it. By morning, the blank space beside the name of Antipas had been copied into a different kind of document, in a different kind of office, a document that would make its way through the efficient channels of Roman administration to the desk of a man who held the juggladi, and who had, over the years, developed a particular intolerance for blanks in his census rolls. The hunt, which had been moving toward Antipas for months with the slow certainty of the tide, had found its official beginning. The sword, which had been patient, had been given a name. They came before sunrise, not because the darkness offered them any tactical advantage. The address was known, the man was not running, the outcome was not in doubt, but because the early hour was itself a message, a demonstration of the state's indifference to the rhythms of private life. The Roman soldiers who moved through the narrow street toward the house of Antipas were not hurrying. They had the unhurried confidence of men who represented something that had never, in the history of this province, failed to get what it came for. They knocked once, not as a courtesy, as a formality. The door opened. What happened in the moments that followed has been preserved not in Roman administrative records. Those would not have bothered with the details of a minor provincial arrest, but in the testimony of the community that witnessed it and carried the memory forward. Antipas, by every account that survives in the tradition of the early church, did not argue, did not bargain, did not ask for time to gather his things or say his goodbyes in private. He moved through the sequence of his arrest with a quality that the witnesses, searching for language equal to what they had seen, could only describe as stillness. Not the stillness of a man who has given up. The stillness of a man who has been preparing for this moment for a very long time and has found, now that it has arrived, that he is ready. The soldiers who entered that home encountered something they were not trained to process. They were trained for resistance, physical resistance, verbal resistance, the weeping and bargaining and desperate negotiation that was the standard human response to arrest. They were trained for flight. They were trained for the sudden animal panic of a person whose survival instinct overrides every other consideration. What they were not trained for was a man who looked at them with something approaching compassion, who offered no resistance, who treated his captors with a quiet courtesy that was, in its own way, more unsettling than any amount of struggle. The state's violence is calibrated to meet opposition. When it finds no opposition, it becomes briefly uncertain of itself, but only briefly. The soldiers recovered their professional composure, bound the prisoner's hands, and led him out into the street. The neighbors who watched from doorways and windows. And there were neighbors watching because in a city of informants, the arrival of soldiers was never private, saw something they would remember. Antipas walked without being dragged. He moved through the street as if the direction had been his own choice. His face in the torchlight held no visible terror. This was the detail they would carry forward and repeat and argue over in the years that followed. The detail that the community of believers would return to again and again as they tried to understand what they had been part of. He was not afraid. They did not take him to the prison. They took him to the temple. There is a specific quality to light at high elevation, a clarity, a thinness, a sense that the air itself is less forgiving than it is in the valley below. The steps of the great altar of Zeus, which descended from the altar's elevated platform toward the city in a cascade of marble that visitors had described as the grandest staircase in the ancient world, were flooded with morning light by the time Antipas arrived. The smoke from the eternal fires above drifted in the windless early air. Below, if you turned to look, and Antipas, by the accounts, did turn and did look, the entire valley of Pergamum spread itself out like a document. Every building, every road, every market and bathhouse and guild hall, the whole machine, visible at once from this height, small and comprehensible, and from up here, almost peaceful. The proconsul was already present. This was itself a statement. Proconsuls did not typically attend the interrogations of minor provincial offenders. The fact that this one had risen early and climbed these steps and arranged himself on the platform above the altar with the theatrical precision of a man who understood that location was argument. This told Antipas something useful about how his case had been classified. He was not being treated as a criminal. He was being treated as a symbol. And symbols required an audience, and an audience required a stage, and there was no better stage in Pergamum than this one. The interrogation was not violent. This is important to understand. The proconsul was a political creature, not a crude one, and the questions he posed to Antipas on those altar steps were questions of genuine political logic. He asked them, according to the tradition, not in anger but in something closer to baffled frustration. The frustration of a man who has encountered an equation that refuses to balance. Why die for something invisible? Why sacrifice everything real? Your life, your family, your place in the world, for loyalty to a king whose kingdom cannot be verified, whose protection cannot be demonstrated, whose existence is, from where the proconsul stood, essentially theoretical. The emperor was not theoretical. His grain ships were not theoretical. The aqueducts that brought water to the city were not theoretical. You could touch those things. You could drink them. You could build your life on them. Why would a rational man choose a ghost over a king? The crowd that had gathered on the steps and in the open space below, because these things always drew crowds, and the crowd always mattered to Rome, which understood that public executions were public arguments, was not howling with anger. That is perhaps the most disturbing detail of the trial of Antipas. They were amused. They were watching a man refuse an offer so obviously reasonable that his refusal could only be interpreted as a kind of madness, a mental peculiarity, a pathetic but ultimately entertaining stubbornness. They watched the way you watch a man argue with weather, with a kind of tolerant contempt for the futility of the enterprise. His integrity read to that crowd as illness. His discipline looked, from the outside, like damage. Antipas said what he had to say. The tradition does not preserve his exact words, but it preserves their shape. He did not recant. He did not negotiate. He acknowledged the authority of the proconsul over his body and denied it over everything else. He acknowledged the reality of Caesar's empire and denied that it was the empire that mattered most. He was polite about it. He was, by every account, entirely clear. The proconsul listened with the patience of a man who has already decided, but who wants the decision to appear to be the result of the prisoner's own stubbornness rather than any failure of imperial mercy. Then he passed the sentence, 2 words that rippled through the assembled crowd and changed the quality of the air on those steps. 2 words that meant something very specific in Pergamum. Something that had been designed centuries before this morning, in a city that was not Rome and not Greece, but something darker and more creative than either. The bull. It had a proper name. Scholars believe it was a version of the device attributed to the ancient craftsman Perillos of Athens, who had constructed it for the tyrant Phalaris of Sicily. But in Pergamum, it was simply called the bull. It was made of bronze, cast in the shape of a life-sized bull with anatomical accuracy and aesthetic refinement that reflected the craftsmanship of a city that took beauty seriously even in its instruments of death. From the outside, it was a work of art. The proportions were correct. The surface was worked and polished with the care of a sculptor who understood that the purpose of beauty is to create desire. And the purpose of this specific beauty was to create a particular kind of dread. The surface was polished to a mirror finish. This was not decorative. When a man was brought before the bull, the first thing he encountered was his own reflection, distorted, curved, compressed by the convex surface into something smaller and stranger than the actual person. You saw yourself diminished before you were diminished. You watched your own terror on the face of the thing that was about to consume you. The craftsmen who maintained the bull kept it polished with the same attention they gave to any civic monument. It gleamed in the Pergamene sunlight. It was, by any objective measure, beautiful. The mechanism was this: a door in the bull's side, fitted with bronze hinges and a locking bar, opened to reveal a hollow interior just large enough to contain a human body. The condemned was placed inside. The door was closed and barred from the outside. Beneath the bull, at a distance calculated to maximize efficiency while minimizing the risk of structural damage to the device, a fire was laid and lit. The bronze, which conducts heat with remorseless thoroughness, would begin to warm. The interior temperature would rise with a gradual measured progression that the engineers of this device had refined over time into something approaching a precise science. But the detail that has haunted historians, theologians, and anyone who has encountered this story across 2,000 years, the detail that the designers of the bull clearly considered their finest achievement, was the acoustic engineering. Inside the bull, at specific points in the neck and head of the figure, thin bronze pipes had been fitted and tuned. The pipes were calibrated to a specific diameter, a specific length, a specific angle of curvature. They were, in the most literal sense, a musical instrument. And what they played was this: when the condemned inside the heated bronze chamber cried out in pain or in prayer, the sound that emerged from those pipes into the open air was not a human voice. The pipes filtered and transformed the sound. What the assembled witnesses heard was not screaming. It was something that resembled, eerily and unmistakably, the bellowing of a bull. The device turned human suffering into theater. It took the most intimate, most private, most fundamentally personal experience available to a conscious being, the experience of extreme physical pain, and converted it into spectacle. It erased the humanity of the person inside and replaced it with the image on the outside. The victim was not a man. He was not a voice. He was the sound of an animal, divorced from its source, performed for an audience that could watch without the discomfort of direct witness. It was, as an instrument of both execution and propaganda, an almost perfect machine. And it was waiting for Antipas. The fire was lit. It caught quickly, as fires do on dry mornings in cities built from stone. The fuel was arranged with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this before and would do it again. And the flames rose to the underside of the bronze chamber with a sound like breath. The crowd had gathered again, different people now, or the same people organized into a different kind of attention, the attention that human beings have always brought to the spectacle of irreversible things. They were quiet. Even the city, which was never entirely quiet, seemed to have located a register of stillness beneath its usual noise. What happened next was not what the device's designers had planned for. The pipes were working. The bronze was heating. The physics of the mechanism were unfolding exactly as they had been engineered to unfold. But the sound that came from the pipes of the Pergamene bull on this particular morning was not what the assembled witnesses expected. They had come to hear bellowing. They had come for the theater of transformation, the comfortable distance of the animal sound that would allow them to watch without seeing. Instead, they heard something that none of the device's engineers had accounted for in their calculations. They heard a man praying, not screaming, not the desperate, wordless animal vocalization that the pipes were designed to convert into something inhuman. The witnesses, including some who had not come to that gathering as sympathizers, including some who would later struggle to explain what they believed they had heard, described a sound emerging from those pipes that was structured. That had the cadence of language. That moved with the rhythm of intentional speech rather than involuntary pain. Some said it was Latin. Some said Greek. Some said it was in a language they did not recognize. But they agreed on this. It was not what they had come to hear, and it did something to the air on those steps that no one present could easily describe afterward. The pipes produced something the Romans did not have a category for, a new song, performed on their own instrument, against their own engineering, inside the machine they had built to erase him. The fire burned through its fuel and died back. The crowd dissolved into the streets of Pergamum. The soldiers returned to their posts. The proconsul went back to his administrative duties. And the city, which had witnessed something it didn't know what to do with, resumed its business with the slightly increased speed of people trying to put distance between themselves and an uncomfortable memory. The great altar smoked, as it always smoked. The morning market opened. The census officials continued their rounds, but something had changed. It was not measurable. It left no mark in any Roman administrative record, but the believers who had watched from the edges of the crowd and those who heard from those who had watched felt it as a physical reality, a drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the weather. The city felt colder, not because Antipas was gone, because of the way he had gone. Because the machine had done everything it was built to do and had somehow, in the doing, revealed something about its own limits. The scroll arrived in Pergamum without ceremony. It was carried by a trusted messenger through channels that had been established for exactly this kind of communication, the careful, invisible network of believers connecting the communities scattered across the Roman province of Asia. It came from the island of Patmos, a small rocky piece of land in the Aegean that Rome used as a place of banishment for people too troublesome to execute and too principled to simply disappear. An old man was there, an old man who had known the teacher personally, who had been present at moments that had changed the shape of human history, and who was now writing from exile with the specific intensity of someone who has been given a vision too large to contain and too urgent to delay. The letter, the document that would eventually become part of the book known as Revelation, did not begin with comfort. It did not open with reassurance or the gentle language of pastoral care. It opened with knowledge. A claim of awareness so specific, so local, so precisely calibrated to the actual geography and political reality of Pergamum that the believers who first heard it read aloud in one of their dark, careful meetings would have felt the hair rise on their arms. I know where you live, not approximately, not generally, where Satan has his throne, the great altar, the proconsul's seat, the bronze bull still cooling on its platform. The writer of this letter knew exactly what the city was, had named it with the precision of someone who understood the architecture of power and was not impressed by it. He knew, and knowing, he had written anyway. The letter acknowledged the faithfulness of the community without sentimentality. It acknowledged the death of Antipas, calling him in words that would be carried across centuries and translated into dozens of languages, a faithful witness and a martyr, without softening what that death had cost or what it meant. And then it offered something that was not an escape from the pressure, not a promise that the proconsul would fall, or the bronze bull would be melted down, or the guild trap would spring open. It offered instead something called hidden manna, a provision that came from outside the system entirely, a sustenance that the empire could not tax, could not ration, could not withhold, because it moved through channels the empire had no instruments to detect. The letter also offered a white stone, a new name written on it, known only to the one who received it. The contrast with the calculi of the Roman court was direct and deliberate. In Pergamum's courts, the stones were white, but the votes were purchased. In the accounting that this letter described, the stone was white and the verdict was final, and no corrupted magistrate could overturn it. The church in Pergamum was not being offered rescue. It was being offered something that, the writer seemed to believe, was more durable than rescue. It was being offered the knowledge that the judgment that mattered was not the one issued on the steps of the great altar. The letter gave the community a choice, framed in language that left no middle ground. You could be the meat inside the bull, consumed by the machine that surrounded you, transformed by its engineering into something that served its purposes. Or you could be what Antipas had been, the fire itself, present inside the mechanism, yes. Enclosed by it, yes. Subjected to its physics, yes. But burning with something that came from a different source than the wood piled beneath the bronze floor. The machine had tried to make Antipas into a sound. He had made the machine into a pulpit. The letter from Patmos detonated inside the community of Pergamum like a slow charge, not with the sudden violence of an explosion, but with the progressive, structural force of something that rearranges the foundations. And the first thing it rearranged was the question that the Nicolaitans had been answering for years, because the letter had named them, not with cruelty, but with the specific, grieved directness of someone who loves a community enough to say the true thing, rather than the comfortable one. The doctrine of the Nicolaitans, the theology of the bowed head and the faithful heart, the calculus of minimum external compliance in exchange for maximum internal peace, had been seen and named and found insufficient. The response inside the community was not swift or clean. Communities under pressure do not divide along clean lines. The families of Pergamum, who had been sheltering both convictions, some members attending guild banquets, others refusing, some producing libelli through arrangements they preferred not to examine too closely, others living with the consequences of not producing them, now faced a rupture that the death of Antipas and the arrival of the letter had made unavoidable. The question that had been managed through ambiguity and mutual silence could no longer be managed that way. You were, finally, one thing or the other. Families split in the specific devastating way that ideological fractures split families, not with dramatic confrontation and clean severance, but with the slow accumulation of avoided conversations, of meals where certain topics were no longer raised, of a growing awareness that the people you loved most had decided that the cost you were willing to pay was either too high or not high enough. The underground community, which had functioned as a single network, began to separate into two distinct organisms with different immune systems and different survival strategies. And in that separation, something unexpected happened. The group that chose the path of Antipas, that accepted the full weight of non-compliance and the full economic and social consequences that came with it, discovered that the loss of everything they had been afraid of losing was, in some ways, a form of liberation. When you have nothing the machine can take, the machine loses its primary leverage. You are no longer negotiating. You are no longer performing calculations about how much you can afford to compromise. You are simply, finally, free in the specific and costly way that only people who have lost everything can be free. The shadow church, the underground, had ceased to be hiding inside the Roman world. It had become definitively something else entirely, something the empire had no administrative category for. Something that would, in the centuries to come, outlast every proconsul, every altar, every census roll, and every bronze bull in the province of Asia. Empires do not fall the way they appear to fall. They do not collapse in a single dramatic moment. No thunderclap, no final battle, no morning when the citizens of a great city wake to find the machine simply gone. They rot. They rot from the specific places where they have been most violent, most certain, most convinced of their own permanence. The paradox of power is that it contains, embedded in its very structure, the mechanism of its own undoing. The more ruthlessly a system eliminates the people who challenge it, the more efficiently it eliminates the people who might have saved it. Pergamum, in the decades following the death of Antipas, began to demonstrate this principle with the slow, irrefutable patience of history. The economic pressures that had been used to crush the believers began by degrees to crush the city itself. The guild system, which had been designed to ensure compliance and extract productivity, had also, as rigid systems always do, eliminated the flexibility that complex economies need to adapt to changing conditions. The trade routes that had made Pergamum prosperous began to shift. The administrative priorities of the empire moved. The great aqueducts that the emperor's propaganda credited to divine generosity required constant maintenance that increasingly overstretched provincial budgets. The population that had been managed so carefully, organized so thoroughly, documented so obsessively in census rolls and compliance records began to thin. People left for cities with better prospects. The ones who stayed found the machine producing less than it cost to operate. The temples did not crack overnight. Marble does not surrender quickly, but the maintenance of a great altar, the constant supply of animals for sacrifice, the priests' salaries, the fuel for the eternal fire, the skilled workers required to keep the friezes paint fresh and the platform stones level. All of this required a tax base and an administrative will that were both, by the 2nd and 3rd centuries, becoming harder to sustain. The smoke from the altar of Zeus became intermittent, then occasional. Then, at some point that no one thought to record because no one was watching for it, it stopped. The fire that had burned continuously for generations, that had been the olfactory signature of the entire city, the permanent perfume of submission and order, went out. And the city, without that anchor, began to feel its own transience in a way it had never permitted itself to feel before. The great altar stood, the marble endured, but the living culture that had animated it, the priests, the processions, the animals, the crowds, the proconsul in his elevated seat dispensing the jus gladi with the casual authority of a man who has never doubted his own permanence, all of that was gone. The throne remained. The one who had sat on it was nowhere to be found. And in that absence, something that the city had always suppressed began to speak. The silence of a dead altar is louder than the silence of a forest. It carries within it the specific accusatory quality of a promise that was not kept. In the year 1878, a German engineer named Karl Humann arrived at a site in western Turkey that the local population had been using for generations as a source of building material. Carved marble blocks, fragments of elaborate friezes, pieces of architectural elements of obvious quality and antiquity. These had been disappearing steadily into the construction projects of the surrounding region for centuries. The stones of one civilization becoming the foundations of another in the practical, unsentimental way that history recycles its materials. Humann recognized what he was looking at. He had found Pergamum. He had found, specifically, the remains of the great altar of Zeus, the throne of Satan, buried and broken and being quietly absorbed into the earth that had always been its ultimate destination. What followed was one of the great archaeological extractions of the 19th century. Over the course of several years, with the permission of the Ottoman government and the financial backing of the Berlin Museum, Humann and his team excavated the altar site with meticulous care and shipped the recovered elements, the elaborate frieze panels, the architectural components, the decorative details, to Germany. In Berlin, in a purpose-built museum that would eventually bear the altar's name, the structure was reassembled with extraordinary precision. The gigantomachy frieze, its gods and giants locked in their eternal struggle, was mounted on the museum walls in sequence, allowing visitors to walk the full narrative for the first time in over a millennium. The Pergamum Museum opened to the public in 1930. The timing has not been lost on historians or theologians who have traced what happened next. The altar that had presided over the execution of a faithful witness in the 1st century, that had been the architectural expression of a power that demanded total submission, was now installed at the heart of a nation whose government was, at precisely this historical moment, assembling the most sophisticated machinery of total submission the modern world had yet produced. The Nazi regime, which would come to full power 3 years after the museum's opening, held its great rallies on a stage whose architectural design was directly influenced by the altar's elevated platform, its broad processional steps, its theater of power arranged to make the individual feel small and the state feel infinite. The stones had moved, and some theologians, reading the history with the specific lens of the Book of Revelation, argued that the stones had not moved alone. This is not a simple argument. History is not a morality play, and the connection between a 1st century altar and a 20th century atrocity is not a matter of direct causation. But there is something worth sitting with in the image of those carved panels. The gods crushing the giants, order obliterating chaos, the imperial theology of total dominance rendered in stone, displayed in the museum of a regime that was, with bureaucratic precision, constructing the most comprehensive system of human erasure in recorded history. The altar had always been a statement about what happens to people who refuse to submit. Berlin, in the 1930s, was making the same statement, in a different language, with different instruments, to a different population, but the logic was identical. The stones remain in Berlin. The Pergamum Museum is currently undergoing renovation, its collection temporarily inaccessible to visitors. The altar sits in a kind of suspended state, neither displayed nor hidden, neither celebrated nor condemned. It waits, as stone always waits, for the next people who will decide what it means. Walk into any major social media platform today and ask yourself a question that the citizens of Pergamum would have found immediately familiar. What is the price of participation? The digital economy of the 21st century has reproduced, with remarkable fidelity, the guild system of the first. To work as a writer, a journalist, an artist, a small business owner, a speaker, a teacher in the modern information economy, you must maintain a presence on platforms whose terms of service function as the libations and libelli of the ancient guild. You must, at regular intervals, perform the correct rituals of compliance, not to Zeus or to the emperor, but to the shifting, unwritten, algorithmically enforced norms of communities whose approval is the price of economic visibility. The mechanism of social death is no longer administered by a Roman census office, but its architecture is familiar. Your seat in the theater, your reach, your visibility, your ability to participate in the economy of ideas is determined by your demonstrated loyalty to the prevailing orthodoxy. Step outside the lines and you do not face a trial. You face something quieter and more comprehensive. The algorithm deprioritizes your content. Your posts stop appearing in feeds. Your account is flagged, restricted, demonetized. You are not arrested. You are erased, made invisible to the mechanisms that distribute attention and resources with precisely the efficiency that the magistrates of Pergamum would have recognized and admired. The informants have been replaced by ratio metrics and report buttons. The Night Watch has been replaced by content moderation systems that, like their Roman predecessors, are better at detecting non-conformity than at evaluating the merit of what is being said. The Nicolaitan argument has been updated for the digital age with barely any modification. The algorithm knows your heart. Just post what it wants. God, or truth, or your actual convictions will understand. Survival requires flexibility. The philosophy of rationalized betrayal does not require a bronze bull or a proconsul to function. It requires only a system of sufficient complexity that the individual compromises feel too small to name, and the aggregate surrender is too large to face. The bronze bull has been replaced by digital isolation, the modern equivalent of being erased from the economy without a single drop of blood being spilled. We have made the execution invisible, and the compliance total, and the documentation of compliance voluntary, even enthusiastic. People self-report their loyalty in the form of posts and reposts and carefully worded public statements of alignment. The libellus has been replaced by the public apology, the retraction, the carefully crafted statement of revised understanding that signals to the watching community: I have performed the sacrifice. I have returned to compliance. I ask to be readmitted to visibility. This is not a political argument. It is not a partisan one. The pressure of the digital Pergamum falls on people of every conviction, every background, every community. The machine does not have a consistent ideology. It has a consistent demand: perform submission. And the question that Antipas answered in the most costly way available to him is the same question that every person who has felt the cold pressure of modern conformity is being asked to answer. Are you bowing to the machine without knowing it? And if you do know it, what then? The believers of Pergamum left behind something that is not in any museum. It cannot be excavated, shipped to Berlin, or reassembled in a purpose-built display hall. What they left behind is a set of interior practices, a discipline of the mind and conscience that functioned as a survival system in conditions of maximum external pressure. The letter from Patmos called it hidden manna, and the provision that comes from outside the system, the sustenance that the empire cannot tax or ration because it moves through channels the empire has no instruments to detect. The first element of this survival system was the absolute refusal to locate their identity in anything the system could take. The Pergamene believers had been stripped of economic participation, social standing, physical safety, and ultimately, in the case of Antipas, life itself. Each of those losses had been designed as a lever, a pressure point that the empire expected to produce compliance. What the empire had not accounted for was a community that had, through discipline and deliberate practice, removed the lever's attachment point. If your identity is not located in your economic status, losing economic status does not break you. If your deepest self is not housed in your social reputation, social erasure does not erase you. The hidden manna was not a supernatural comfort that made suffering painless. It was a source of meaning so interior, so thoroughly independent of external validation, that the full machinery of Roman social control could not reach it. The second element was community, but a specific, honest, unsentimental kind of community. Not the community of shared comfort, where people gather to be told that everything will be fine and that their suffering is temporary. The underground church of Pergamum was a community of shared reality, where people gathered to tell each other the truth about what they were facing, to hold one another to the discipline that they had collectively chosen, and to maintain, in the darkness beneath the temple foundations, the specific human experience of being known by people who could not afford to pretend about the cost of what they were doing together was, for these believers, the closest thing to armor that the first century offered. The third element, and perhaps the most demanding one, was a long view, a temporal perspective that refused to accept the machine's assessment of what was permanent and what was transient. The empire told you, through every instrument at its disposal, that it would last forever. The altar, the statues, the census rolls, the bronze bull, all of these were designed to communicate permanence, to make the individual feel like the only variable in an equation that would otherwise never change. The discipline of the long view was the practice of remembering daily, against the full sensory weight of Roman architecture, that empires had ended before and would end again. That marble cracks, that smoke stops, that the proconsul dies, that the machine eventually, always, breaks down under the weight of what it costs to maintain. Manna, in the original story, was provision that appeared fresh each morning and could not be hoarded. It was, by its nature, a daily dependency, a practice of return rather than a single acquisition. The hidden manna of the Pergamum letter carried the same structure. It was not a single moment of clarity that inoculated a person against all future pressure. It was a daily practice of return to the source of identity that the machine could not reach, the conscience that has not been sold. The knowledge renewed each morning that you have not traded the thing that cannot be replaced for the thing that was never worth having. Walk through the ruins of the Asclepion today, and you will find something that no Roman engineer planned for. Beauty. Not the engineered beauty of the original complex, not the calculated grace of the healing pools and the theatrical corridors designed to dissolve individual will. The beauty that has arrived in the Asclepion's ruins is uninvited, ungoverned, entirely indifferent to the purposes for which the place was built. Wild grasses grow through the stones of the underground tunnel floor. The acoustic channels through which the priests once whispered suggestions now carry only wind. The walls that supported the structure of gaslighting, that elaborate, sophisticated system for telling sick people that their illness was spiritual and that spiritual illness required institutional compliance. Those walls are home to lizards and birds and the patient, indiscriminate life of things that grow without permission. The names of the priests who managed the Asclepion are not remembered. The names of the administrators who designed its psychological architecture, who calculated the precise diameter of the acoustic pipes for maximum suggestibility, who oversaw the training of the snake handlers and the choreography of the incubation rituals. None of those names have survived. The machine that was built to produce a specific human experience, to shape a specific human response, to manage a specific population's access to healing and belonging and meaning. That machine is grass and stone and the sound of wind in channels that no longer carry whispers. But Antipas is remembered, not because of what was done to him, not because of the bronze and the fire and the acoustic engineering of his death. He is remembered because of what he would not do, because of the specific, costly, ordinary decision made not once in a dramatic moment, but accumulated across years of daily refusal to not locate himself in anything the system could take. He is remembered in a letter written by an old man on a rocky island, a letter that has been read in every language on every continent for 2,000 years. The proconsul who sentenced him is not remembered. The craftsmen who polished the bull are not remembered. The census officials who noted the blank space beside his name are not remembered. The informants who made the chain of events possible are not remembered. The machine forgets. Truth persists. This is the geometry of hope, not the optimistic assertion that things will get better soon, or that the pressure will lift, or that the system will reform itself. The geometry of hope is the observation, quiet, mathematical, verifiable across the full sweep of human history, that the things built on truth last and the things built on the requirement of submission do not. Not because the universe is sentimental, but because truth is load-bearing in a way that compliance is not. The empire of Pergamum was built on the requirement that every person in it perform a kind of ongoing self-betrayal, a daily, small, economically rational act of saying something with their body that their conscience did not believe. That kind of structure requires constant enforcement. It is expensive to maintain. It generates invisibly, in the people it manages, a corrosive fatigue that weakens the very social fabric the machine depends on. And eventually, always, the maintenance cost exceeds what the machine can produce, and the whole structure begins its long, slow return to stone and grass and wind. You have listened to this story because something in you recognized it. Perhaps not the specific geography of ancient Anatolia, not the particular machinery of Roman provincial administration, not the bronze bull and the altar smoke and the underground tunnels of the Asclepion, but the structure, The pressure to perform compliance, the economic leverage of the guild, the social mathematics of visibility and erasure, the Nicolaitan argument whispered in the voice of pure reason. That structure you recognized, because it is not historical, it is permanent. It exists in every place where power is organized, in every age, in every form that human civilization has taken. It is Pergamum, it is Berlin, it is your office, your city, your screen. The question that the letter from Patmos posed to a small community meeting in the dark, beneath the temples of a city that wanted them to disappear, was not a theological abstraction. It was the most practical question available to a human being. What are you actually made of? Not what do you believe in the comfortable privacy of a conscience that has not been tested. Not what you would do in hypothetical circumstances that have not arrived. But here now, in the actual conditions of your actual life, when the guild demands the libation, when the algorithm demands the performance, when the machine presents its bill, and the price is the specific, small, daily piece of yourself that you had hoped to keep. What are you made of? Antipas was not a hero in any conventional sense. He was not a general, not a philosopher, not a man of extraordinary natural gifts or unusual resources. He was an ordinary person in an extraordinary situation who had made over the years a series of ordinary decisions about where his identity was located. He had decided, before the soldiers came, before the proconsul spoke, before the fire was lit, that there was a part of himself that was not available for sale at any price the machine could offer. That decision, made in the dark and the quiet, before anyone was watching, was the decision that made everything else possible. Not easy. Possible. The guardian of the flame, the person this story is ultimately addressed to, is not someone who has achieved some special state of spiritual development that places them beyond the ordinary pressures of ordinary life. The guardian is the person who has simply decided again and again, in small moments that feel too minor to matter, that the flame is worth guarding, that the conscience is worth keeping clean, that the stone the empire's court cannot issue, the white stone, the new name, the verdict from the court that the machine cannot appeal, is more permanent than any libellus, any census roll, any seat in any theater that any empire can offer. Your Pergamum is real. The altar above it is real. The fire beneath the bull is real, in every form that the 21st century has constructed for it. The pressure is real, and the cost of refusal is real, and no one who has not felt that cost should speak lightly about bearing it. But the names of those who bore it are the names we remember. The names of the proconsuls are in footnotes. The names of the faithful witnesses are in the text itself. The bull roared. Antipas prayed. The city heard something it could not categorize and went back to its business, slightly colder than before. 2,000 years later, his name is still being spoken. The machine that killed him is grass and stone. The question it could not answer is still open, still live, still addressed, with the intimacy of a letter from a prisoner to a community he loves, to you. Will you be the one who bows? Or the one who, in the specific and ordinary conditions of your actual life, roars louder than the bull?